Today we celebrate the feasts of St. Philip and St. James. St. Philip was a fisherman from Bethsaida, and he followed Jesus, and he's the one that we hear about in the gospel saying, "Master, show us the Father, and that will be enough." And we hear this beautiful moment of Jesus saying, "Whoever's actually seen me has actually seen the face of my Father." So when we see Jesus, it's like a window into seeing how much our Heavenly Father loves us. When we see him in this image of divine mercy, but also when we see him in this cross to say, wow, God loved me so much that he didn't hold back anything, even his only beloved Son. So that's St. Philip. St. Philip, he gave his life for Jesus in the first century. Now, St. James, remember we were talking about St. James the Greater, is the one that was with Peter and Andrew in that kind of tighter circle around Jesus. But then there's this other St. James. And this St. James, he became the first bishop of Jerusalem. And you hear about him in the Acts of the Apostles during this time when the people that were not Jewish were all of a sudden coming to Jesus, and the apostles were trying to figure out, well, what do we need to do here? How are we supposed to bring them in? And St. James that we talk about today, he's a part of that story in a really beautiful way. But something that's really cool about St. James, this St. James, is he was a cousin of Jesus Christ. We hear about that he's called a brother of the Lord. And sometimes we get confused and say, well, did Jesus have brothers and sisters? And that word a lot of times when you hear it in the Bible, so it'll pop up at different times. So Jesus was an only child. So Mary only had one child, Jesus. But when you hear the word brothers, it means other family members. And it means cousins. It means relatives. So it's always important to remember that. If someone said, well, Jesus had a whole bunch of brothers and sisters, like, well, actually he had a whole bunch of cousins. Does anyone here have any cousins? Does anyone here have cousins in the school? I know there's a couple of you guys. Okay. So some of you guys have cousins in the school. Imagine if your cousin was Jesus. Wouldn't that be kind of wild? You're like in class with Jesus. Imagine if you're like playing on the same sports team with Jesus. Wouldn't that be kind of cool? Jesus is like, pass it to me. And you like kick it over there and he scores the goal. Or maybe he passes it to you and you head it in. You're like, yeah, Jesus, awesome. Like, isn't that kind of wild to think about? Sometimes we forget that Jesus Christ, though God, the God of the universe, he made himself small, and he entered into ordinary family life. And for 30 years, remember, how old was Jesus when he died? 33. So 3 of those years, he was preaching. He was teaching. He was going around doing miracles. But for 30 of those years, he was at home. He was going to school. He played with his friends and especially with his cousins. Another of his cousins was St. Jude, who also became one of the apostles. And one of his famous cousins was St. John the Baptist. So just imagine them spending time together. But you know what's interesting is St. James, St. Jude, and even St. John the Baptist, they didn't fully know that Jesus Christ was the Son of God. He hadn't really revealed that at that time. So they were playing games. They were eating lunch. They were going on field trips. They were playing their own version of biblical soccer, whatever that was. They were having fun. They were probably doing tricks on each other. And yet, this cousin of theirs actually turns out to be the Son of God. and he's hidden for all of these 30 years. So even when they go through elementary school, when they go through junior high, they didn't know who he was. They saw by his actions that he was someone who always would do the right thing, but he was someone who also cried, who laughed, who had fun, who did all those different things that are good, true, and beautiful. And yet they only found later when he started to preach, and then he looked at each one of those cousins of his and said, "Follow me." And they did. And they followed him not just as a cousin, but realizing that he was so much more. And so it's a reminder for us that God, a lot of times, is found in the most hidden of places, in the most surprising of places. And because Jesus Christ became man and he entered into ordinary human life, he entered into a family, he entered into having cousins, that everything that's ordinary in life can then become transformed. And this is actually what the psalm talks about. We might not have caught this, but it says, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament proclaims his handiwork. Through all the earth, their voice resounds to the ends of the world, their message." And a lot of times we think of this in terms of the apostles proclaiming the message to the ends of the earth, but it also means creation itself, in its hiddenness, in its ordinariness, is actually proclaiming Jesus. But you have to have eyes to see it. If we have our eyes to see, we can see the majesty of a sunset and cry out, "You are the King of glory." The sunset is revealing to me how beautiful you are. The little moments that you're going to have today, God will be speaking through every single one of those moments. Either something as a learning lesson to recognize something that we should not hold on to, or recognizing something that is beautiful, that is good, that is true, that we need to hold on to. But God is always speaking to us. And he speaks in the most hidden of ways. So I just encourage you to ask the Lord for eyes and ears to hear the way that the hidden God speaks, even in the ordinariness of school life and family life.